I used to live in the woods, a good distance from town. No cell service, no internet, not even a landline or satellite. I lived there for a year and it was pleasant initially, but became a nightmare. By the end of my residency, I was a shell of who I was. It broke me. I'm an Eagle Scout, and I'm not a stranger to nature. Because of this, I didn't mind taking night hikes. No bears in the area, only few coyotes, rarely mountain lions. Even still, I would carry a pistol just in case. I lived basically at the base of a mountain. First thing, every full moon I'd climb to the top of the mountain because the moon would be bright enough for me to not need lights. It was always pleasant and I'd have a flask of whiskey to help keep me warm and plenty of cigarettes. I called it my werewolf hike, and it was usually about a 7-hour round trip. There weren't any trails, so I'd just going up and usually ended up taking a pretty casual route that I'd grown accustomed to. This time I went up and I had brought my girlfriend at the time. She is deathly afraid of mountain lions, so she had to take my shotgun with us as a condition for her joining me. It wasn't very cloudy when we departed my home, but was pouring by the time we were making our way down, and I got lost. I ended up following a ravine down because I knew it would likely end up at a creek I lived by. Girlfriend and I came to a point where we needed to descend into the ravine to continue following it, but it was a steep decline. I tried to come down diagonally, but the rain soaked the ground and came out from under me. I slid about 6 feet, and then fell straight down about 10, hit my head on some rocks and landed square on my shotgun, and was buried in the earth falling from above me that gave away. I woke up shortly after to a hysterical girlfriend freaking out over me. She helped me up and I wrapped my bloody hands with a combination of extra socks and a bandana I had in my pack. My shotgun, thank God, was okay. I felt drunk after the fall and was stumbling around clumsily, but continued on. About 30 minutes down the ravine, my girlfriend asks me if I smelled a skunk. I'm a smoker, but the heavy, wet air carried the smell of weed easily to us. To set the picture right, when the clouds come out, there is no moon. We were navigating by feel at that point, not using lights as they were properties scattered around with crazy rednecks and whatnot. There was very little light. As we approach the smell, we see jagged rebar stabbed into either side of the ravine, with deer skulls impaled on them, and furry, decomposed carcasses littering the ground below them. The weed smell is super strong at this point, and curiosity and confidence got the best of me. I climb up a lower part of the ravine and see the most glorious, lavish outdoor weed grow. It was almost funny how tightly the plants were growing to each other, and how bushy they were. We noped the hell out of there with my shotgun unslung the rest of the way back. A few weeks after, I decide I want to find this farm again on a full moon night. I don't know why, I was bored out there. Don't judge. I go alone because my girlfriend is too timid. I try to retrace my steps from the rainy night and happen to cross one of the few dirt roads. I follow the road for maybe 20 minutes to the south where I believed the farm was, until I heard an engine and some distance behind me. I hop off the road and wait for what ended up being an ATV, golf car thing, come along. Sitting on it were 2 fat hunting camo wearing sister fucking rednecks, both armed with AR-15s, and all I had was a pistol. Mind you, my pistol was carried because of a mountain lion, and now would never ever want to use it for people. If I knew these dudes were even in the area, I wouldn't have tried to seek out their operation. Again, with the curiosity and confidence, I follow their trail. I smell the farm and cautiously approach, but I heard nothing. I was a bit behind them, after all. And just like that, my world lit up, and I hear screaming. I drop down from a low crouch to lay down, and put my hands on my pistol. Turns out, these guys had lighting stapled up through the trees about 20 feet up, and they were cheering when they got their generator running to turn them on. I backed out slowly and took note of where the farm was. I had no intention to steal anything. I had never had a problem with the morality of marijuana and had zero intention on reporting them. At this point in my life, I didn't smoke a whole lot, and I suppose I just liked poking my nose where it didn't belong. A few months after, I ended up finding out those guys lived only 4 miles up my road. They were brothers and liked to smoke a bit of ganja and were very open that they grew. Actually really nice dudes, and I hung out with them a lot, and eventually told them about that night. I also had a mountain lion stalk me around my house for months. I'd hear it circle my house late at night, climb the tree next to my house, and jump on the roof. Sometimes it would jump onto my high-rise back porch and stare into the sliding glass door. The first night he did that was the first night I knew he was around. I thought it was a person trying to break in. I screamed my head off, with a surefire and pistol in hand. "I can see you. Lay on the ground right now or I will drop you." Through the curtain of the sliding door, I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. When I ripped open the shades, I was met with 2 giant eyes. We looked at one another, and I contemplated blowing the thing away through the glass door. I regret not doing it. This asshole terrorized me for many months and months, snarling outside my window at 3 a.m. when it saw my dog inside, sitting in the trees on my property at night when I got home. I had to chaperone my dog on potty breaks with a 12 gauge because the cougar thought he was a Scooby snack. One day he wasn't creeping around anymore, and I never saw him after that, but always felt eyes on me. By this point, because of the 50-yard walk from my parking spot to my front door, I was strapped with my pistol. And when I was home, I was carrying. When I was walking to or from my car, I was also carrying. When my nearest neighbor got a divorce, her ex-husband was convinced a 21-year-old me was sleeping with his 60-something-year-old ex-wife. He was a hitter, and eventually, she kicked him out of their house. This guy was convinced she left him for me. She was just getting slapped around and getting sick of it. Still, I'd hear his 1980 300 Mercedes turbo diesel creep past my house late at night and park in the turnout by my house. He'd stay there all night, apparently to see if she was leaving my house in the morning, or who knows why. He'd leave weird notes on my door, even knocked on it at 4 in the morning to have a beer. She eventually moved, and so he stopped talking to her, and consequently me as well. There was an abandoned house next to mine. It had burned down a decade ago and was basically a shell. Fallen in roof, partial walls, holes in the floor. Straight out of the Fallout wasteland. Once my dog got out of my yard and ran in there to play like an idiot. I chased him in, not realizing I had stumbled into a horror movie with the haunted house. I come walking into this shanty, shouting his name. I swore I'd become self-aware and could hear the people in the theater screaming, "Don't go in there." I heard his collar jingling as he ran around, but couldn't see him. I heard him yelp, and his collar wasn't jingling anymore. I bust out a light and go back home to grab my gun, as I figured the mountain lion had come back. Turns out there was the ring-styled 18th century wall in the crawl space that he fell into. It was only like 8 feet up, so I set up a rope, jumped in, and got him out, and then I climbed out myself. There were scratch marks in the stones from the animals that had been trapped in there before, and their bones covered in dirt on the floor. I was happy to leave. Then there was one time I got dosed with LSD without knowing it, and shot at a demon crawling through my window, but that's a whole different story. Oh God, Dry Creek broke me. I literally got cabin fever. So, there's this island in Lake Superior called Isle Royal. The island is really cool because it is full of wolves and moose that supposedly walked into it when Lake Superior was frozen over a long time ago. But there are no bears, so when you go there, your bear protection can be fairly lax. But for our group, that meant we could hike in relatively quiet, without the fear of surprising a bear. So along the entire length of the island is this big ridgeline, and it was awesome hiking. One day as we were walking along this ridge, we hear some rustling to our right. At the base of the ridge, and when we looked to see what it was 2 baby moose, but no mama. Now, this is true of just about every animal I have ever encountered. But moose, specifically, are very protective over their young. So, seeing these baby moose, but not their mom, was strange. But as we're watching the baby moose do their thing, we hear huffing from the other side of the ridge. Turning around, we see the mama moose on the other side. So we are at the top of this ridge, standing directly between the mom and her babies. And the mama is just staring us down. Now this part of the ridge was fairly rocky, so to keep walking, we would have needed to start walking directly toward the babies. Clearly this wasn't an option. Instead, all we could do was sit down on the top of the ridge and wait, and hope the moose would leave soon. So we sit down, hoping to get low enough that the mama moose can't see us over the ridgeline, and we wait, listening to the mama moose and her babies on either side of us. Eventually, we couldn't hear them anymore, so we assumed that they left, and we get up and keep walking, and we don't see them again. But for the rest of the trip, we were constantly looking around to stay out of the way of any more moose. I know this story in particular isn't that scary, but it goes to show you that moose in the wild, particularly caught off guard, can be extremely dangerous, and they can cause life-threatening injuries if attacked by one. Be safe. I was hunting a big field for some white-tailed deer. It was public land, and I decided to not set up a tree stand and just sit behind some heavy cover on the ground. I try to get to my spots well before sunup, so I'm not making any noise at first light. When many deer start to move, of course. I got to my spot at about 5 in the morning, and it was absolutely pitch black, and all I had was my headlamp. After I switched off my headlamp, it was quiet for roughly 30 seconds when suddenly I heard a howl from my right side. It was clear the howl came from the edge of the field I was in, roughly 200 yards away. It sent shivers down my spine. About 30 seconds passed when I heard a second howl in the opposite direction on the other end of a field, probably another 200 yards the other way. At this point, I'm pretty freaked out, but I figured that it's highly unlikely anything would attack me. Not much longer, and from directly behind me, somewhere in the thick of the woods, comes a third howl. Now, I feel like I'm surrounded, and I'm terrified. My truck was 500 yards away from me, to my left, along the edge of the woods in the field, and down a narrow path that cuts right through the woods. I flicked on my headlamp, took the safety off my gun, and equipped my hunting knife, and I got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I waited until the sun came up before I went back and actually hunted. I never saw a deer the entire weekend, which is odd because there's normally a lot of wildlife in the area, but not this time, and it was unusually quiet. I presume whatever was howling drove the deer out, and I don't blame the deer one bit. The entire experience was frightening, and I've done a lot of hunting and camping, and I've spent a ton of time in the woods, both during the day and night, and I have never been freaked out like that. Something wasn't right. There was something there that I couldn't see, that I feel like would have made me vulnerable had I not left as soon as I did. This will probably get buried, but 2 years ago, myself and 2 other people were camping in Yellow Bottom, which is in the Cascades of Oregon. About 3 a.m., I woke up hearing what sounded like a bunch of people having a campfire party. Nothing huge, and not even scary, just talking, laughing, stuff like that. I was kind of pissed since we'd specifically come up to get away from college kids and such, and now somebody had set up camp in what sounded like less than 100 yards away. But I couldn't see fire or light through the tent walls, and since that was my big concern, fire in the woods, I just kind of ground my teeth and went about it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I wake up again. This time somebody's let a little kid start crying, and it's annoying. Like not wailing, but just sniffles. That long-term crying that kids do. So, I listened for about 5 minutes, and since I'm not a monster, I've kind of got this prickly feeling that maybe there's trouble. You know, little kid crying all alone, where the hell are his parents, etc. I started to get up, and my friend, who I thought was sleeping, grabs my arm, just about to give me a heart attack, and says, "Don't go out there, just wait." He knows the woods better than I, and he sounded actually scared, so I sit and wait. And yeah, a few minutes later, the crying stops, and the party starts back up. But the weird thing is, I can't really pinpoint now what direction the party noise is coming from, because I was trying to tell if maybe it was a group who had found the kid and is now all hanging together, but I couldn't tell what direction it had come from. The party went on for about another hour, just until dawn, and then all of a sudden, nothing, like cut off in the middle of a sentence or a laugh. I was completely freaked out by that, and I think I may have even made a noise when it stopped like that. My friend, who hadn't even sat up the entire time, just said, "Stick Indians," and then rolled over and fell back asleep. I got up when the sun finally completely made its way up, and made coffee, and kind of looked around, but I'm not brave like that, and so I didn't go far. There was nothing, no campfire, no tents I could see through the trees. Nothing. We packed up that day, and I asked him what Stick Indian was, and he wouldn't tell me. I had to come back and Google it, and even now I'm not sure if what's online is true, or made up, or what. But if you look it up, apparently it's some kind of forest spirit that lures people out by making noises like crying babies, or people having a party, and then, I don't know, maybe it eats them or something. So that's my creepy thing in the woods, and I don't have any proof, but people who know the Pacific Northwest, it's way up Yellow Bottom, past the official camps, on the left-hand fork of the main road, down that logging road and right by the river. The campsite with the huge fallen over dead trees. That one. Me? I've never been back there since. I was doing a long hike from Springer Mountain to Fontana Dam, about 165 miles. I was a little behind schedule on day 3, where I had planned to take a near zero day and spend some time on mountain crossings. Initially, I was going to spend night 2 in the hostel there, but a big storm prevented me from crossing Blood Mountain the day before. As a result, I had to revamp my plan and add about 7 miles to my day. So after a soda and a burger at Mount Crossing, I hit the trail again. I come to a road crossing, and there's this guy with an old 80s style external frame pack taking a break. Being me, I stopped, pulled out a Cliff Bar and a smoke, and decided to have a conversation. I could use the break anyway. We talked for a bit, and I alluded to what shelter I was headed to. Do not do this if you don't trust the person. See, that was my first mistake. The guy seemed a little odd, but that's what it was. We started talking at about 1 p.m., and he had started his day at Neal's Gap, and I started on the other side of Blood Mountain. We had started at roughly the same time, and I had taken a 2-hour break. My pace easily put me ahead of this guy by 7 or even 8 miles. The shelter I had alluded to was actually out of his range, or so I thought. There was also, if I remember correctly, 3 shelters between us and my final destination. We parted ways, and I kept on trucking. I get to camp and do my usual thing. I made good time, so I actually had quite a bit of downtime. Several hours had passed. I had prepped for the night and was reworking my plan while talking to other hikers. And this guy rolls into camp looking like he had just gone on the Baton Death March. He trucked it to catch up with me. The guy started to show his true colors in camp. He was really loud and obnoxious, and would just not leave me alone. I decided that night I would carry a bit of extra water and do breakfast outside of camp to try and distance myself from him. The next morning, I was just up before sunrise. I packed and I hit the trail. A few miles up, I stopped for breakfast like planned. Not 1 or 2 miles later, I ended up tweaking my knee on some rocks crossing an area. I needed to get some rest and ice this thing. I go to the gap where you can either hitch west into an area where most people go, or hitch east into Helen. I decided to go into Helen as I figured I'd also take advantage of the Bavarian atmosphere that the town provides. Lo and behold, a few hours later, the same guy comes rolling into my hotel. I found out later that he had asked some southbounders about me and figured out where I went. I thought, now this is creepy. I had to get this guy away from me. I figured while in town I'd kill him with kindness, so I got some beers and made some more conversation. We were talking about our plans and I knew this was my chance. I told him that because of my knee I was probably going to take the next day off as well and continue on after that. He said he'd join me, just like I expected. I said cool and went to my room. And as I got to my room, I packed up and set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning. I phoned the owner of the hotel to make sure she could give me a ride to the trail that early. The next morning, I quietly grabbed my gear and hopped in her car. We headed the few miles up the road to the trail ahead, and I basically started running. I never saw the guy again, but I heard stories about him up the trail. That was a hell of a trip. Not 2 days later, I had a bear bed down within arm's reach of me in my tent. That's a story for a different day, though, as it wasn't creepy but comforting in a weird way. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail northbound in early August, just a few years ago, and I was a day out of Davenport Gap, heading to Hot Springs, North Carolina. I don't remember the exact shelter I was at, but I know it was north of Mac's Patch. This time of year, there aren't many people on the trail, and other than a couple of cars at Mac's Patch. I hadn't seen or spoken to another person in a full day. I decided to end my hike for the day at about 7 p.m. so I could eat dinner and prepare for bed before dark. I was also filming a little diary of my hike as a gift for my sister. I ate, filmed, reloaded on my water, and hit the hay right as it got dark and the crickets came out. At about 2:30 in the morning, I was startled awake, but not by a noise, rather the absolute silence around me. I didn't hear toads, crickets, owls that you'd expect to hear, and that I had heard when I had gone to sleep just 6 hours prior. I looked around but saw nothing. Everything was perfectly still, and I made the decision that I had to get the hell out of there. I packed all my gear in just about 5 minutes, threw on my headlamp, grabbed my bear bag, and noped my way all the way up the trail. I'm pretty sure I averaged around 4 miles an hour in the pitch black until sunrise. Because of such an early departure, I finished my planned 18 miles into Hot Springs by 10 a.m., which was nice. To this day, I have no idea what was there that morning, but I know something was there. I've encountered tons of predators in the woods before, from black bears to coyotes, but I've never experienced a calm like that before. Made me think it was maybe some sort of large cat, or even worse. Who knows what could have been out there, and who knows what would have happened had I stayed until sunrise. Maybe nothing, but I sure wasn't sticking around to find out. Camping in general can be freaky. Not so much during the day, but when it gets dark, it gets dark. Whenever people say the Blair Witch Project wasn't scary, I always ask them if they've ever been camping. If you have, then that movie probably freaks you out. Laying in your tent at night, not knowing what is 3 feet away from you, is terrifying. It's pitch black and quiet, like being alone in a creaky old house, except with a 10 multiplier. Every sound could be a bear, wolf, or person out to get you, and if you're in a tent, you can't see what's there. Probably my freakiest experience happened when I was a kid and went camping in Colorado. It was dark, but still too early for us to be tired, so We were just sitting around the fire, doing the do, talking, eating s'mores, whatever. I would say we were telling scary stories, but screw that. We were probably talking about Disney movies or something like that. Now keep in mind how dark it is out there. The light from the fire only goes out so far, and it creates like this wall where all light seems to stop. We were all sitting there when, all of a sudden, my sister looked up and saw a pair of eyes looking at us. Me and my sister started freaking out. We were right on the edge of losing our minds. Our parents calmed us down and told us not to move. We had no idea what it was, and it was nearly impossible to judge how big it was. So we just sat there and waited for it to go away, which it eventually did. It was probably a raccoon or something, but 6-year-old me was pretty sure it was a Bigfoot. I'm not sure if it was a raccoon though, since both my parents were quite unnerved by the whole experience and were rather quick to silence and hush their children to never have them mention it again. I was at a lake in the woods, fishing with my 4-year-old kid and wife. There was nobody there except for us. The lake was surrounded by a dense forest of trees, brush, and the like. We were about 50 yards from our vehicle, down a hill at the bank with our poles resting in the water. The fishing was slow, so I decided to test out my new camera. So I walked around the general area while my wife sat with her child and tended the fishing poles. I walked up a hill from the bank and through the dense trees to the mouth of a clearing where all of a sudden I see 4 guys approximately 20 yards away just out there in the woods. They looked like a cross between grunge band members and deep woods hillbillies. I don't know if they were dirty or had unwashed looking raggedy hair and clothes. We were in the boondocks, so they just stood there, looking at me for what seemed like a good solid 2 or 3 minutes. The look in one of these eyes of either desperation or malevolent intentions. I played it off and just focused my camera in a different direction. Then, I noticed that one of them had somehow managed to move closer to where I was, and immediately I felt uneasy. I mean, why in the hell were these guys out here so far in the middle of nowhere? No fishing poles, no hiking gear, nothing. The one that had moved closer to where I was said out of the blue, "Hey, won't you come take our picture?" Then he kind of just half giggled, revealing a rotted looking mouth. He had as much teeth as a jack-o'-lantern. Not to judge this guy, but he looked very sketchy, and I could definitely feel his intentions were not good. I kind of smiled back nervously, and just kind of nodded and started making my way back to my family and the fishing spot. As I walked away, I heard one of the ones in the distance holler, "Hey man, come over here, we want you to take our picture," and then heard the others laughing, and I noticed they were slowly making my way towards my direction. They were talking amongst themselves and laughing sinisterly. I could not make out what they were saying, and that was good at this point because I was casually but quickly leaving the area. I did make out a few comments like, "Yeah, I think he's alone," and another say, "Nah, something, his car's right over that way." Anyway, I finally made it back down to the bank and immediately told my wife to quickly start gathering our stuff and head back to the car. She could tell by the sound of my voice and demeanor that something was wrong. We both half-heartedly packed up, grabbed the kid, and headed up back to the bank to where our vehicle was at. Still the only other people out there, and right as we got to the car, I noticed, and my wife saw for the first time, what I was getting away from. They were in the distance, coming out of the woods and heading right towards us. We threw our shit in the back, jumped in the car, and started heading out. I didn't want to worry my wife, but had the realization that there was only one way out of there, and that was on an old dirt road that meandered through the woods and passed near where they were at. I was afraid we might get cut off, so I floored it and just thought I will stop for nothing. As we were making our way out, I had seen something to the right of my peripheral vision, and yep, it was one of them in full stride running towards us. This time I noticed he had something in his right hand that looked like an elongated tire iron or something. We lost them in the woods just about as they made it to the road. A while later, maybe 30 minutes, we made the old country concrete highway that led back to the city. At this point, we see another vehicle in the distance coming in our direction. A beat-up old work truck. I thought, oh shit, they caught us. Then as the vehicle approached, we got a much better look at the occupants. An old couple, and the husband looked like an old lumberjack type, definitely looked like he could take care of himself. They slowed down as they approached and rolled down the window and asked if everything was okay and if we were lost. I said no, we know how to get back to the main highway from here. I told them about what happened back there, and he didn't even seem fazed. Just said that we should not be out here alone, and there's been some stories. I didn't ask, and then he said he never comes out this way without his rifle and his knife. Anyway, we thanked them and got out of there to never return. Bedded down for the night on my tarp. A few minutes later, heard some rustling coming from my immediate left. Turned on my flashlight to see a bear's ass literally 2 feet from my nose, using one of its front paws and face to rifle through my backpack. I'd like to say I let out a manly war cry to scare it away, brown bear of course, but it came out more of a whoo. Bear scampers forward, trips on the pack, and face plants into a fallen log. Looks back at me and then runs off. Then, another time, an elk stepped on me while I was asleep. Hurt like a son of a bitch, and fortunately, didn't pierce my wrap canvas. I yelled in pain. Elk gave one of those whistle bugle cries and stomped off. That was scarier than a bear. If it had stomped on me, I'd have a minimum of a few broken ribs. At night at my fire, getting ready to cook up some food, this damn coyote, at least I think it was kind of dark, sneaks up and grabs my food bag and just runs off. I didn't see it until he had the satchel in his mouth, so I take off after it. It drops the sack under some trees, runs a bit further and turns around to watch me. As I stop to grab my food, I hear more coyotes in front of me, close and to the right. First one was still looking at me, although it didn't sleep much that night. I went turkey hunting with my dad in the Shawnee National Forest several years back. I was about 10 at the time and took one afternoon to hike and scout hunting spots. Along the trail, we saw a few blood splatters and drips, but not a big deal, it's nature after all. After about a quarter of the mile up the trail, however, we come up to 3 dogs hanging from a tree, gutted, blood out, and skinned. Okay, now that was pretty weird. We kept going a bit further as there was a bluff not too far up from the way that was pretty cool to look at. Come to the bluff and we find weird symbols burned into the ground on the sides of the rock wall. Candle wax absolutely everywhere, and more blood all over. By the time my dad, whom I've never seen scared in my life, looked at me and said, "Let's go," we took off at a pretty quick pace back to camp. The worst part is that we didn't even leave the campsite. So that night, I laid awake in the camper, freaking out at every sound I heard. I still get goosebumps thinking about that event.